Since I was young, I had felt a close connection to nature. I was fortunate enough to live in Vancouver, British Columbia for most of my childhood, which is one of the most beautiful places to live in the world. Growing up in a place such as this, it was hard not to feel a direct connection to nature. Here we have large ancient forests of redwood trees that are 1,500 years old. We even have our very own rainforest, the Great Bear Rainforest. The air you breathe is so clean and light, you cannot help but feel like you've been filled with life and renewed vigor. In fact, much of the nature I experienced had its forms of healing effects, including its natural hot springs and sandy beaches. And at night, you didn't have to go too far out of the city to experience a clear, starry sky. I was grateful to grow up surrounded by such beauty. And it was a great concern to me that we could be possibly the destructors of the wonderful life and harmony that nature worked for millennia to produce. At least, this was what my education was teaching us. At the time, it was all about the supposed growing hole in the ozone layer, acid rain, and the destruction of the rainforests. I grew up watching The Smoggies and rewatched Fern Gully about 30 times. Industry was often portrayed as black, slimy goo that killed anything that it touched. I had no concept of how anything functioned from the city level to the communal level to our very own home. I had no concept of how energy worked or how things were made. I had a romantic concept of what it would be like to live in the forests and would picture this in my imagination as something free of any threats or challenges, that the food would be bountiful, that our shelter would be spacious, warm, and cozy, and that the weather was, of course, always well-behaved and temperate. Though I understood that there were poor people in other parts of the world, I had a complete disconnect as to why their living primarily off of what nature only supplied naturally to them was always portrayed on television as something miserable, dirty, full of disease, malnourishment, and hardship. But when I imagined myself living off of nature, that it would be bountiful, easy, comfortable, and serene. Clearly, the fact that I was living in British Columbia, a relatively temperate region located beside the Pacific Ocean with plenty of rainfall, contributed to my romantic conception of living in the forests with no care or worry. But this was not the only reason for the difference between what I saw and what I imagined in my mind. We are, after all, a tropical species that originated on Earth along the equator. It was only through our improved ability to keep ourselves warm and generate food in unfriendly climates that we were able to migrate into the colder regions. This was made possible by our use of energy. Sadly, it would be many years well into my adulthood before I would begin to seriously ask myself how we fundamentally provided for our basic needs, such as warmth, shelter, food, and clean water. Then there was the question of how we provide for a life that is considered empowered, such as access to healthcare, electricity needs for households, transportation, agricultural production, and sewage treatment. I realized that unlike my younger self, who naively thought I could have access to such items as books, lanterns, warm blankets, and pillows, and all the gadgets I would need, the reality was that living in the forest could only entail these wonderful gadgets we so often see in the movies showing their characters living off the grid, if we still maintained the capability of building and manufacturing such things, which requires energy. I myself, living in the forest, would not have the capability of making most of these gadgets on my own. We see this point demonstrated in the case of Richard, the protagonist in the 2000 film The Beach, whose off-the-grid community has no choice but to make the perilous journey into town to purchase basic supplies they cannot provide for themselves on their own. Thus, all of the wonderful world, seemingly self-sufficient and living off the grid, is actually almost entirely dependent on the grid and its manufacturing capabilities, which are made possible through the use of energy, which is mostly fossil fuel energy. Without this, the world would not be something any of us would be envious of. I realized that to truly live entirely off of the grid would entail a life that would be mostly consumed with meeting my most basic needs, that is, food, shelter, water, and warmth. The more inhospitable the environment you live in, whether it be temperature, drought, storms, pesky, or dangerous wildlife, the more difficult and challenging it will be. Such a life is full of unpredictability, risk, and hardship. Most of us living such a life would do the same laborious work day after day and remain in the same location for our entire life. I also realized that unlike my younger self, I would not be content with such a life of living in the forests on my own. For instance, my love of books has only grown, and I would never voluntarily choose a life that would limit my access to read and learn from all the brilliant minds of the past and present. I also very much enjoy the gift of having access to others through a system of communication that requires the use of satellites in space. I'm glad to have the possibility to communicate with people from all around the world, and I view this as a very positive modern development. I am also very grateful for the opportunity to travel to many parts of the world, to visit a diverse array of cultures and places, including the great works of nature. In fact, we take for granted how much more free time we have today thanks to our increased access to energy, such as the washing machine, electric stoves, subway systems, clean water systems, running water, and electric heating, which saves each of us hours a day of grueling labor chopping and gathering wood just to heat our homes with toxic air. In our day and age, we have by far more free time that is not consumed with meeting just our basic needs, and that is a very positive modern development. It has long been understood that access to energy plays a deciding role in the social progress index. In other words, whether a country or a community will have a poor to average to high living standard. This includes access to the best medical care, more nutritious food, access to clean water, and adequate shelter. In fact, what we are seeing in the world today is an overall improving trend in the diminishment of poverty. The quality of living has increased, as well as the lengthening of life, all thanks to an increased access to affordable energy. Take the cases of India and China as examples of how access to cheap and affordable energy, which is predominantly fossil fuel-based, has given rise to dramatic increases in per capita GDP and living standards, as well as life expectancy. The reality that we are often not told about is that fossil fuel energy use is what is ultimately deciding the social progress index amongst nations in the world today. This is because it is still by far the most affordable and efficient energy. Despite how much we hear about how alternative green energy sources are changing the world, the fact is that the vast majority of energy consumption around the world has come from coal, oil, gas, and nuclear power, with renewables making up a very negligible fraction of the whole. It is fossil fuel use which has made possible the alleviation of poverty throughout the world and increase in lifespan. Thus, access to energy is clearly integral to our well-being and health. However, does this come at a cost that we will ultimately not be able to pay. That is, can we live in a world where both we and nature can simultaneously flourish? Presently, there is the predominant thought in academia and political policy that the answer to this is no, and that we are in the midst of a climate crisis, and that this crisis has been caused by the dependence on fossil fuels.
I am Al Gore. I used to be the next president of the United States.
There have been various warnings over the past 50 years over what is claimed to be our human-made climate crisis, with countless predictions made by some very influential people, many who continue to be very influential despite their predictions being very wrong over the course of 20 to even 50 years. In 1989, the Associated Press reported a set of climate predictions from New York Director of the UN Environmental Program, Noel Brown, including that entire nations could be wiped off the face of the earth by rising sea levels if the global warming trend is not reversed by the year 2000. And that the most conservative scientific estimate would be that the Earth's temperature will rise 1 to 7 degrees in the next 30 years. John Holdren, President Barack Obama's top science advisor, had a particularly dire prediction according to close collaborator Paul Ehrlich in his 1986 book, The Machinery of Nature, where he wrote, "As University of California physicist John Holdren has said, it is possible that carbon dioxide climate-induced famines could kill as many as 1 billion people before the year 2020. Before the universities and media told the general public that the experts predicted rapid, catastrophic global warming, it told the general public that the experts predicted catastrophic global cooling. This claim became popular in the late 1960s and through the 1970s, such as the Guardian headline in 1974, "Space Satellite Shows New Ice Age Coming Fast," and the New York Times in 1978, "International Team of Specialists Finds No End in Sight to 30-Year Cooling Trend in Northern Hemisphere." Throughout the late 1960s and early 1970s, Paul Ehrlich, renowned ecologist who has spoken for over 50 years on fossil fuels, the author of best-selling books and winner of the Crawford Prize, what has been called the Nobel Prize of Environmentalism, predicted that resource depletion, including fossil fuel depletion, plus an increasing population, would lead to a population bomb and mass starvation unless dramatic government measures were taken. In 1971, Ehrlich said, by the year 2000, the United Kingdom will be simply a group of impoverished islands inhabited by some 70 million hungry people. And in 1974, he wrote, "America's economic joyride is coming to an end. There will be no more cheap, abundant energy, no more cheap, abundant food." The Club of Rome predicted in their The Limits to Growth, published in 1972, that continued growth in consumption would exceed the available resources of gold, silver, copper, zinc, natural gas, and petroleum. Instead, we have seen an increase today in proved reserves of fossil fuels. Proved reserves means the amount of coal, oil, gas that is considered viable to produce given today's technology, market conditions, and knowledge. In 1970, Paul Ehrlich predicted that worsening air pollution is certainly going to take hundreds of thousands of lives in the next few years alone. Renowned ecologist Kenneth Watt, another designated expert, predicted at the present rate of nitrogen buildup, it is only a matter of time before light will be filtered out of the atmosphere and none of our land will be usable. Kenneth Watt had also predicted in 1970, when global cooling catastrophizing was the trend, that because of the particles emitted into the air by burning fossil fuels, scientists have solid experimental and theoretical evidence to support the following predictions. in a decade, urban dwellers will have to wear gas masks to survive air pollution. By 1985, air pollution will have reduced the amount of sunlight reaching Earth by 1/2. In 1989, Bill McKibben wrote, "A few more decades of ungoverned fossil fuel use and we burn up, to put it bluntly." And the choice of doing nothing, of continuing to burn ever more oil and coal, is not a choice. In other words, it will lead us, if not straight to hell, then straight to a place of similar temperature. It is important to note and to acknowledge this trend of inaccurate climate catastrophe predictions. That not a single catastrophic prediction has come true over this 50-year course, yet many of these same voices continue to be respected in their ongoing predictions of climate catastrophe. This is not meant as a cheap or biased remark, it is a factual remark. And if we want to look at the real science behind such claims, such false predictions and projections must be held accountable by a scientific standard. This is even more relevant and significant to acknowledge today since we are, unlike decades ago, shaping law and policy in order to respond to these ongoing predictions and projections of what is claimed to be a human-made climate crisis. For instance, the solution that is being proposed by the European Union is the goal to achieve net zero by 2050, which means to be completely off of fossil fuel use in less than 30 years from now, with the plan to be 100% sustainable on zero carbon emitting energy, not including nuclear energy. This will most clearly affect the well-being and health of billions of people. Thus, we should ask ourselves the following fundamental questions before diving headlong into this. Is it possible for zero carbon emitting energy, primarily renewable energy, to replace the reliance on fossil fuel energy? And why hasn't this been achieved already? Is renewable energy really environmentally friendly in its production, use of land and other resources, and waste disposal? How is climate crisis defined? What are the justifications behind the claim that the Earth is experiencing a climate crisis, that is, catastrophic climate? What are the justifications behind the claim that fossil fuel use is contributing to a climate crisis? We should really take the time to look into the scientific evidence to back this claim, especially since there is a very long history of crying wolf in climate catastrophe. It is reckless to base large political and energy policy on something that has a track record of being 100% wrong. Thus, what is the evidence today that is being presented to justify such policies as net zero by 2050? What is behind the proposals for how energy production and the energy market are going to be organized to meet the 2050 goal? This will entail a detailed overview of the European Union's Fit for 55 plan. Can we truly live on Earth such that all humans can flourish and have access to a high standard of living? Or do we need to compromise in this? Can only some humans flourish at the evident cost of others? Can we truly live on Earth such that both humans and nature can flourish? And do we live in a zero-sum world with limited resources? And if we do not, how does this affect how we should be regarding our relationship to others and the planet? This 6-part documentary series will focus on addressing these questions. The viewer should be aware that even if we want to believe that it is possible for renewables to replace fossil fuel energy, the reality is that today, presently, there is no capability for renewables to replace fossil fuel energy after several decades of being on the market and receiving massive government funding. Thus, it is a massive risk. And present EU policy to make significant cuts in fossil fuel energy use before sufficient alternatives are online is a reckless policy. We should not rely on further claims and projections, especially when such things have a terrible track record of accuracy, but rather hard scientific and economic evidence as to how these energy solutions are going to play out and whether they are indeed physically and economically, that is, affordable, viable solutions. Because if they are not viable solutions, the consequences will be truly catastrophic. We will be condemning billions of people to death, since there will simply be not enough energy to go around, and those that do survive will have shorter lifespans and decreased quality of living. Are we prepared to push a policy that will tell billions of people that they do not have the right to the same use of energy as other parts in the world? Will our policies actively and consciously keep over half of the world impoverished and condemned to a life of unnecessary hardship?